So I feel I need to get something off my chest before I begin. And so I've always felt a deep, really deep ethical contempt for people who go to conferences and then, show up just for their own talk, but not for the talks of others. So it's a bit like skipping the line. And since I wasn't there yesterday and this morning, I feel the need to come up with an excuse for that. But luckily, that is very easy to do. There are downsides to being a local at an international conference. So for one, it's a working week. So I was at work at the office and hence couldn't officiate here. But at last I clocked out there and I'm now clocking in here. So I'll jump right into it. Benjamin's position within the Frankfurt School is by no means unambiguous. Though deemed its fellow traveler, the relationship is a difficult one, permeated with tensions. And to begin somewhat arbitrarily, the said difficulties and tensions are sufficiently exemplified by the circumstances surrounding the publication of his famous essay on the work of art. The French original was published in 1936 and is missing the entire first section of the essay. Benjamin's letters from the time immediately prior to his first publication, this first publication, testify to an uneasiness and anger over the editorial process. The publication was overseen by someone named Hans Claus Brill, the secretary of the Parisian section of the Institute for Social Research. Brill refused to listen, turning a deaf ear to the author's pleas, which prompted Benjamin on the 29th of February, 1936, to write a letter to Horkheimer, the Institute's then director. A letter was full of harsh words regarding Brill, who supposedly cut sections of the text behind that is Benjamin's back. Surprisingly, in his response, dated March 18th, Horkheimer actually took Brill's side, and he said the following, I quote, "As regards your complaint about Mr. Brill, I of course understand where you're coming from. On the other hand, however, as you yourself indicate, you are also familiar with our own situation. We must do everything in our power so as to protect the journal as the scientific body from being dragged into political discussions in the press. This would seriously jeopardize our work in this and many other directions." End of quote. So the serious threat and the object of self-censorship, which ought to spare the scientific body from a likely lynching by the media, was actually Marx, mentioned at the very beginning of Benjamin's essay. The 1930s were a time of a violent opposition against communism, an opposition which was symptomatically embodied by the otherwise internally divided, yet externally unified coalition of fascists, conservatives, liberals, and social democrats. So 1936 is also the year of the anti-Comintern Pact between Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan, joined a year later by Mussolini's Italy. So historical circumstances just mentioned favor caution. However, from a remote historical perspective, the erasure of the first section can be persuasively defended despite and beyond these historical circumstances. The section's contribution to the whole is modest. Instead of substantially serving the essay itself, it rather serves the self-identification of its author, his inscription into the tradition of historical materialism. The modesty of the contribution is further matched by the ultimately problematic references to Marx, convincingly critiqued by later Marxologists. These references include a historicist reading of Marx's Capital in the tradition of Kautsky, Luxemburg, and Lenin. These readings suggest that Marx paints a picture of capitalism in its infancy, a picture that must be updated and reformulated in accordance with capitalism's subsequent developments. And the same goes for Benjamin's uncritical adoption of the adaptation of the base superstructure divide promoted by Marxism-Leninism. So since the inner conceptual gain of the introductory reference to Marx is negligible at best and untenable at worst, both the editorial intervention and the allusion to historical circumstances appear spot on. However, when it comes to the remaining two editorial changes, things are far less self-evident and much more complicated. Though themselves minimal, they maximally alter the political scope of the essay. Moreover, they alter it in ways which in turn elucidate in an unflattering way the political ideology of the Frankfurt School. Brill erases the words fascism and communism, which, considering historical circumstances, doesn't strike us as odd. But what is odd, however, are the two substitutes. Fascism becomes the totalitarian state, while instead of the word communism, we get the constructive forces of humanity. So the initial terms carrying a certain political and conceptual weight are substituted for the abstract discourse of conventional social sciences. Except this time, the political price that critical theory must pay for this reactive sublimation is much higher. We are prompted to question the critical character of critical theory itself, while catching a glimpse of its reactionary liberal ideological core. The liberal vocabulary replaces communism with forces of humanity, whose constructive character appears post facto as a double apology of fascism and capitalism. Now, differences between Benjamin and the Frankfurt School are best exemplified by differences between Benjamin and Adorno as the key figure of the school, and they surely exceed my concrete examples in turn considering views concerning wider views of technology and mass culture. Thus, it is no wonder that the gap between the two is most palpable when it comes to their respective treatments of cinema, this paradigmatic bundling together of both, of art and technology. More precisely, ultimately the dispute concerns the valuation of comedy, mainly that of Chaplin, a valuation whose entire drama revolves around the problem of laughter. Is laughter a reactionary or a revolutionary affect? Or does it embody both, and does the very split of social totality? Moreover, what is the connection between laughter and Marx's critique of capitalism? As a worthy heir of the philosophical tradition, going back to Plato, Adorno was notoriously suspicious of laughter, especially of laughter generated by the products of the culture industry. In laughter, servitude finds a space of false freedom that is nothing but a mask of conformism. In cultural industry, he writes, and I quote, "There is laughter because there is nothing to laugh about. Fun is a medicinal bath which the entertainment industry never ceases to prescribe. It makes laughter the instrument for cheating happiness. In wrong society, laughter is a sickness infecting happiness and drawing it into society's worthless totality. Laughter about something is always laughter at it, and the vital force which, according to Bergson, bursts through rigidity in laughter is, in truth, the eruption of barbarity. The collective of those who laugh parodies humanity," end of quote. In sharp contrast to Adorno's conception of laughter as a vehicle of mass dumbification, laughter as false happiness, and laughter as indistinguishable from sadistic ridicule, for Benjamin, and I quote, "There is no better trigger for thinking than laughter," end of quote, which of course does not mean that every laughter is the beginning of thought. And the quote continues, "In particular," Benjamin says, "convulsion of the diaphragm usually provides better opportunities for thought than convulsion of the soul," end of quote. I have to pause just for a sec. We cannot overlook the curious fact that according to the famous anecdote, philosophy effectively begins with laughter. In this anecdote, we encounter Thales, the first philosopher, out on a night walk, looking at the stars and overlooking the ditch in front of him, falling right into it. The scene is then observed by a Thracian woman who responds to it with an explosive laugh. Should her laughter be read in Adornian fashion, that is, as a ridiculing of philosophy, or should we read Thales's fall in a Benjaminian way, that is, not as the fall of philosophy, but rather as a falling into philosophy, into its ditch, so that philosophy is born of convulsions of the diaphragm? Anyway, if we briefly consider the topic of Marxism and laughter, then Benjamin's defense of laughter is an exception rather than the rule. But if we nevertheless look for an influential figure, of course, Brecht comes to mind. And the line from Benjamin I just quoted, in fact, refers to Brecht's epic theater, lavish only in occasions for laughter, as he says in The Author as Producer. No surprise, then, that Adorno's criticism of Benjamin often concerns the insufficient liquidation of Brechtian motifs, further split into the two related topics of Marxism and laughter. It is well known that Brecht was precisely the Marxist who, with the seriousness of a humorist, spelled out the link between thinking and convulsions of the diaphragm by insightfully recognizing the comedy of dialectical thought, calling Hegel the ultimate humorist. In this talk, I propose to focus on laughter and dialectic. However, what concerns me here is not the dialectic of laughter, but rather the laughter of dialectic. Laughter as laughter of dialectic is essentially speculative, belonging to reason, Vernunft, and hence is situated beyond the reflexive logic of the understanding, Verstand. To quote Kant's critique of judgment, something absurd, something in which therefore the understanding can of itself find no delight, must be present in whatever is to raise a hearty, convulsive laugh, end of quote. Not the dialectic of laughter, but rather the laughter of dialectic, its laughing matter. I'm not interested in how to think laughter dialectically, but rather in ways in which laughter already thinks dialectically, always already structuring dialectic at its most fundamental. And Brecht's Ziffer, the character from his refugee conversations, notoriously says with regards to Hegel's science of logic that he's never met a humorless person who understood Hegel's dialectic. So what is dialectic then? And here is one of its all-time best definitions. Dialectic is merely der Witz einer Sache, the punchline of a thing. Brecht is not merely saying that grasping dialectics requires a sense of humor. He's telling us that one can only think dialectically if we have not a sense of humor, but rather a sense for the humor of dialectics, which is not the same thing. Furthermore, many readings of this passage overlook the telling connection between the topic of laughter and Hegelian dialectic on the one hand, and Marx's critique of political economy on the other. A page earlier, Ziffer draws attention to the so-called third-rate Marxism without Hegel, namely precisely without the humorist Hegel of the science of logic. And I quote, "A half-decent understanding of Marxism will set you back between 20,000 and 25,000 gold marks these days, according to a colleague of mine, and that's without the trimmings. You don't get any of the proper stuff. You get a third-rate Marxism without any Hegel." End of quote. But before I continue along these lines, I must mention another of Benjamin's references, which appears as far removed as possible from the one just mentioned. According to Benjamin, Baudelaire's essence of laughter, and I quote, contains nothing other than the theory of Satanic laughter. In this essay, Baudelaire goes so far as to view even smiling from the standpoint of such laughter. Contemporaries often testified to something frightful in his own manner of laughing, end of quote. This is from Benjamin's Central Park. With this reference, laughter acquires an unsuspected tonality. Its effective value enters the domain of a new hedonic paradigm. Instead of laughter as cheerful humor, we witness here a demonic and destructive laughter as central for Benjamin. So what is Satanic laughter? What is its nature? What does its demonic essence consist in? And before we are led astray by free association, Benjamin provides us with the key. In the text, The Concept of Art Criticism in German Romanticism, he writes, "Satan is dialectical," end of quote. So laughter owes its satanic character to the feature mentioned by Brecht, namely to the very nature of dialectical thinking, marking self-identity with alterity. Let's take a step back. According to Brecht, and I quote, Hegel contested the idea that one equals one, not only because everything that exists changes inexorably and relentlessly into something else, namely its opposite, but because nothing is identical with itself, end of quote. Brecht's point is very precise. Dialectical thinking does not refer merely to the passage of every entity into its external opposite, but rather to the inner alterity of each entity, that is, the entity's negativity in relation to itself as entity. Hegel writes in The Science of Logic, I quote, "Such identical talk therefore contradicts itself. Identity, instead of being in its own self-truth and absolute truth, is consequently the very opposite. Instead of being the unmoved simple, it is the passage beyond itself into the dissolution of itself," end of quote. Here's how Benjamin cryptically continues his remarks on satanic laughter. I quote, "The dialectic of commodity production, the product's novelty as a stimulant to demand, takes on a significance hereto unknown. In mass production, the ever self-same, das immer wieder Gleiche, manifests itself overtly for the first time," end of quote. From laughter through dialectics to commodity production. The dialectical nature of laughter holds the key to the commodity form. I have dealt with this elsewhere, so let me be very brief here. Brecht's insight into the comic nature of dialectical thinking ultimately relates to a very precise property of the relation of identity, namely to its reflexivity, without which it would dissolve into nothing. Nothing is identical with itself, Brecht writes. Reflexive oppositivity, as opposed to reflexive identity, lies at the conceptual core of Marx's analysis of the commodity form. On the one hand, a commodity is a relational entity, the value of which is entirely dependent on a relation to other commodities. However, this universal translatability presupposes a point of impossibility, without which it would have been impossible. In other words, commodity exchange is made possible by an impossibility. This point of impossibility concerns the impossibility of a particular commodity to express its own value. This means that the commodity relation of equivalence is not reflexive, and that the values of commodities can only be equated on condition that commodities are not equatable with themselves. It is precisely this reflexive oppositivity which fuels the dialectic of commodity production. The satanic laughter provides a key to the dialectics of commodities, but can be further linked to the demonic image of the commodity proposed by Marx, the commodity as a sensuous, supersensuous thing, entertaining, and I quote Marx's Capital, entertaining grotesque ideas far more wonderful than if it were to begin dancing on its own free will, end of quote. The commodity relation of equivalence rests on a reflexive non-relation, and perhaps the image of a dancing commodity is but an approximation of an image of a laughing commodity, subjected to the vibrations of the diaphragm. Laughter is the affect of non-relation, the self-splitting of the commodity. Its inability to express its own value could be put forth as follows. Commodities can't tickle themselves. They can only be tickled by other commodities. So there's an impossibility there. So let's briefly return to dance, mentioned by Marx. Laughter and dance are situated at the intersection of body and spirit, populating their split. Dance is the laughter of the body. Laughter is the dancing of the spirit. It was Nietzsche who first notices their intimate relationship. In Zarathustra, he writes, And we should consider any day lost on which we have not danced once. And we should call any truth false that has not been accompanied by one burst of laughter. End of quote. In his reading of Nietzsche, Deleuze mistakenly interprets dance and laughter as elements of anti-dialectics. By his lights, and this is taken from his book Nietzsche and Philosophy, a chapter suggestively titled Against Hegelianism. So by Deleuze's lights, I quote, dialectic proceeds by opposition, development of the opposition or contradiction, and solution of the contradiction. It is unaware of the real element from which forces, their qualities, and their relations derive. It only knows the inverted image of this element, which is reflected in abstractly considered symptoms. Dialectic thrives on oppositions because it is unaware of far more subtle and subterranean differential mechanisms. End of quote. That is why, for Deleuze, dialectic is foreign to laughter, and hence the natural ideology of resentment and bad conscience. Deleuze paints a thwarted image of dialectic as premised on external opposition, thus himself overlooking the real element of reflexive oppositivity at the very heart of dialectical movement. The element not of bad conscience, the spirit of gravity, but of satanic Dionysian laughter. So, just to sum up a little bit, so Deleuze is fully conscious that there's another step required here, but he just takes this step into a wrong direction. So he moves forward instead of back. So instead of a kind of a hyper-Hegelianism, he produces an anti-Hegelianism. When we talk about the economy and laughter, we cannot mention Bakhtin, Benjamin's famous contemporary. Bakhtin understood carnival culture as an offspring of the general culture of laughter. Laughter is conceived of as an instrument of the ruled in their struggle against the ruling class. Laughter dethrones by symbolically perverting the existing relations of power and authority. By redressing, in a gesture of travesty, beggars as rulers and slaves as masters, laughter profanes power and ridicules the false transcendency of the ruling order. Laughter is a means of leveling that reduces the tricky spirituality of the ruling class to a profane material principle. We immediately see that such leveling isn't dialectical in the aforementioned sense. Though relying on the mechanism of reversal into opposites, though being the vehicle of destabilizing social differences, the carnival is ultimately the great leveler, relying entirely on the principle of an external identity of opposites. Consequently, Bakhtin's theory of laughter lacks a truly dialectical character. Instead of recognizing external oppositions as mirroring reflexive oppositivity, Bakhtin drowns self-difference in the regime of universal equivalences. Ultimately, the carnivalesque redressing is the commodity market in miniature, such that the carnivalization of culture finds its model in market profanation. That which appears as a revolutionary attack on class society effectively amounts to its reconfiguration in accordance with the commodity market and its principle of equivalent exchange. This aspect of Bakhtin conceptions of carnival culture is often overlooked, despite the fact that for Bakhtin, the market of early modern European cities is the carnival's primordial breeding ground. The beginnings of carnival culture coincide historically with the beginning of capitalist development in Europe. The latter emerges in the High Middle Ages, but begins flourishing in the 16th and 17th century. Structured like the early capitalist free market of equivalent exchange, premised on the identity of opposites, the carnival owed its transgressive character to the conditions of pre-capitalist domination in which it existed. Its provisional overturning of social hierarchies and privileges could only have thrived in conditions of pre-capitalist exploitation, which rested upon a relationship of personal domination and dependency. Thus, the carnival enacted within culture the same process that the expansion of commodity markets enacted in the economy. With the triumph of capitalism, the carnival lost its subversive potential because the economy of the carnival coincides with the carnival of economy. In developed capitalist societies, that is to say, under the new conditions of capitalist exploitation, the carnival retained its ritual, cultural, transgressive function while losing its critical edge. From here, let me return to the discussion between Adorno and Benjamin. In this discussion, laughter plays the role of a differentiator of the difference between what is politically revolutionary and what is politically reactionary, and its fate is ultimately decided with reference to Chaplin's films. It is worth mentioning, against the backdrop of discussing the carnival culture, that Adorno sees in film as the primary consumable of mass culture the paradigm of the cheating happiness by means of which the exploited class is deprived of the insight into the exploitational nature of industrial capitalism. According to Benjamin, on the other hand, Chaplin's films, and I quote, Chaplin's films appeal both to the most international and to most revolutionary emotion of the masses, their laughter, end of quote. In the German original, Benjamin does not say their laughter, but merely laughter. But to continue, Adorno rejects such a view as mere romanticizing and basically reduces Chaplin's films to reactionary mass products. Later on, he had a change of heart, but that's another story. So, however, we run into Benjamin's defense of laughter also in other less expected places. The crown example of this are the closing lines of his essay, Experience and Poverty, from 1933, which together with the other texts, for instance, the artwork essay and the storyteller essay, relies on the diagnosis of the incommunicability, impoverishment, and the collapse of experience at the height of modernity, reducing the subject to an ear in search of a word. This dissolution of experience pushes civilization caught into wars and economic crises over the edge while calling for its reconfiguration along the lines of a messianic barbarentum. And barbarentum is not barbarai, not barbarity or barbarism, otherwise addressed in Benjamin's famous thesis on the philosophy of history that states that there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism, barbarai. But barbarentum, let's translate it as barbarianhood, interrupts the reciprocal conditionality of barbarism and culture. In her book, Barbarism and Its Discontents, Maria Bolezzi writes, I quote, "Barbarentum is not civilization's loyal opposite, but the rupture in the edifice sustained by culture and barbarism," end of quote. As such, barbarianhood aims at a new collectivity, a community of creatures who have shed all similarities with man. And I quote Benjamin's Experience and Poverty essay. In its buildings, pictures, and stories, mankind is preparing to outlive culture if need be. And the main thing is that it does so with a laugh. This laughter may occasionally sound barbaric, well and good, end of quote. The quote echoes the Marxian topic of the revolutionary overturning of existing power relations, an overturning accompanied by laughter as a revolutionary affect, while the barbarically sounding laughter further echoes Baudelaire's notion of satanic laughter. But the key point I want to highlight once more is the simultaneous linguistic kinship and tension between Benjamin's project and Adorno's already quoted reply that rejects the eruption of barbarity while declaring the laughing collective a parody of humanity. The difference between Adorno and Benjamin, as it relates to two disparate conceptions of laughter, as either a reactionary or a revolutionary affect of the masses, is perhaps best illustrated by their irreconcilable interpretations of cartoons. Whereas Adorno sees in the violence of Disney films the cryptogram of bourgeois violence, Benjamin sees in these same films a critique of these same bourgeois relations and the possibility of a breakthrough. So 2 quotes. The first one is Adorno. Cartoons hammer into every brain the old lesson that continuous attrition, the breaking of all individual resistance, is the condition of life in this society. Donald Duck in the cartoons and the unfortunate victim in real life receive their beatings so that the spectators can accustom themselves to theirs. End of quote. And here's a quote from Benjamin. In these films, mankind makes preparations to survive civilization. Mickey Mouse proves that a creature can still survive even when it has thrown off all resemblance to a human being. He disrupts the entire hierarchy of creatures that is supposed to culminate in mankind. End of quote. So is it not highly indicative that out of all the possible Disney characters, Adorno chooses Donald Duck, known for his Adornian pompousness, bitterness, and quick-temperedness, while Benjamin's beloved cartoon character is the happy, mischievous, and heroic Mickey Mouse? So the formula would hence read, Adorno is to Benjamin as Donald Duck is to Mickey Mouse. The best example embodying these 2 competing theories of laughter, an example of the drama entailed in the encounter of the masses with the art of animated films, is provided by Preston Sturges's 1941 comedy Sullivan's Travels. In it, we encounter another Disney's character, namely Pluto. Unlike Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse, Pluto is not entirely humanized, and thus is all the more suited to embody the Benjaminian creature. Within the Disney universe, Pluto is Mickey's pet, so it shouldn't surprise us if he proves philosophically closer to Benjamin than to Adorno. But to return to the mentioned scene from Sullivan's Travels. It's a famous one, and Yuval has already commented on it on another occasion. In the scene that takes place in a southern church, we witness a group of prisoners, including Sullivan, joining a congregation of impoverished blacks to watch Disney's animated short, Playful Pluto, from 1934. On the one hand, the scene brilliantly illustrates Adorno's point. If the prisoners and the segregated black paupers are laughing at the continuous attrition on the screen, their laughter serves the forgetting and the reconciliation with the beatings they themselves suffer in real life. The carceral and the racial cage is momentarily substituted for the cage of laughter. However, such an Adornian reading does not exhaust the full complexity of this particular scene. The laughter of social rejects has an unmistakably ominous, demonic, satanic character, such that the scene doesn't strike us, the viewers, as in the least comical. The faces of the outclassed and of criminals indeed throw off all resemblance to a human being, assuming a figuration of inhuman creatures, or perhaps the barbarianhood of a new collectivity. Moreover, their satanic laughter is dialectical in the precise sense of emerging at the point of dissolution of self-identity. At first, Sullivan is perplexed and somewhat amazed at the demonic roaring laughter of those around him, but is very quickly overtaken by the same affect of the masses. This initial outburst of laughter is automatic and mechanical, as if he is seized by some inhuman force. However, immediately after this momentary outburst, Sullivan calms down, collects himself, turns to the fellow prisoner seated next to him and asks, "Hey, am I laughing? Am I the one who is laughing here?" Therein resides the essence of dialectical laughter, undermining the subject's reflexive identity, the subject's identity with himself. In laughter, Sullivan ceases to be what he is. His is a laughter of an inhuman creature preparing to outlive culture. Let us show the clip, 3 minutes.
People, go Israel out of Egypt came. Let my people go. On the left, the proud oppressor's land. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Let my people go. Will those nearest the lights kindly rise and dim them, please?
Do.
Am I laughing?
So Benjamin sees cartoon characters as creatures of satanic laughter that have thrown off all resemblance to a human being, while Adorno reduces these same characters to symptoms of traumatized bourgeois subjectivity. Their resilience and literal destructive plasticity, to use Malabou's term, their immeasurable capacity for enduring violence, places them beyond the concept of trauma. The new subjectivity, emerging from the burning ground of experience, therefore disrupts, and I quote, the entire hierarchy of creatures that is supposed to culminate in mankind. That is, in man as a reservoir of tradition and inner life. The new subject is emphatically a subject without a biography. Its life cannot be written because it is situated beyond life. Zizek takes note of the connection between post-traumatic subjectivity and the death drive. And I quote, "The properly philosophical dimension of the study of post-traumatic subject resides in this recognition that what appears as the brutal destruction of the subject's very narrative substantial identity is the moment of its birth. The post-traumatic autistic subject is the living proof that subject cannot be identified, does not fully overlap with stories it is telling itself about itself, with the narrative symbolic texture of its life. When we take all this away, something, or rather nothing, but a form of nothing remains, and this something is the pure subject of death drive." End of quote. Aren't the new creatures of satanic laughter emerging against the background of culture outlived precisely subjective forms of the self-destruction of the self? Their laughter does not spring from a Bakhtinian culture of laughter. Rather, it emerges at the point where culture outlives itself. As such, the laughter signals the dialectical nature of these new subjective forms emerging from the dissolution of experience. It is dialectical insofar as it remains irreducible to an identity of the opposites, which exhausts itself in the logic of market equivalences, in turn standing for the reflexive opposition as the dialectical core of subjectivity. Before concluding, a key question must be asked. So what of all this? So this will be the unthought through part of this talk, intended to highlight briefly and very provisionally some of the possible uses of these conceptions for understanding contemporary power structures, especially as they relate to technology. So the conclusion is open-ended and serves to indicate my future plans. I said that the new subject, as embodied in autistic laughter, is a subject without a biographical identity. It is not the post-traumatic subject emerging from the field of destructive torrents and explosions, but rather the subject of trauma, namely the trauma of dialectical self-splitting. Does our contemporary historical moment not incite us to undertake a double revision of this Benjaminian subject matter? The first of these two revisions concerns the status of information as means of communication. The old orally transmitted story that Benjamin talks about is characterized by an openness that distinguishes it from information. Information is verifiable, it demands referentiality, which guarantees its semantic conclusiveness. Nowadays, Benjamin writes in The Storyteller, no event comes to us without already being shot through with explanations. In other words, by now, almost nothing that happens benefits storytelling. Almost everything benefits information, end of quote. The story gives an account of an event without cementing its meaning, such that its meaning can resonate and is carried on by continuous storytelling, like a virus. Quote Benjamin again. The most extraordinary things, marvelous things, are related with the greatest accuracy, but the psychological connections among the events are not forced on the reader. It is left up to him to interpret things the way he understands them, and thus the narrative achieves an amplitude that information lacks, end of quote. In our age, when the new media are taking over the function of informing the public, Benjamin's, but also Adorno's and Agamben's criticism of information seems to be brought to its limits. Today, we appear to be witnessing a return to the story and of the story as a means of misinforming the public. It is left up to us to interpret things the way we understand them. Information thus loses what is integral to it, namely verifiability. For the second revision concerns the return of biography, a return that places the story and storytelling at the very center of the modern, let's call it digital dystopia. The managing of informational flow is left up to algorithms which generate via our participation in digital systems and through tracking mechanisms our unauthorized biographies. These are no longer stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, but essentially stories that are told about us by the big other in the form of predictive algorithms, risk modeling, biometric systems. Hence today, the dead biography seems to be experiencing a massive dystopian comeback. But wherein exactly lies the difference between Benjamin's concept of biography and the new reality of unauthorized digital historiography? What sets apart the dystopian scenario of digital alienation from traditional biography, which consists, as Benjamin notes, of unfolding the views of himself in which he, the subject, has encountered himself without being aware of it? In this traditional sense, biography confronts the subject with the intimate core of its identity, standing opposite of it as an alien exteriority in which he is unable to recognize itself. And this point of misrecognition is the extimate core of subjectivity. The biography enacts a dissolution of the self-identical biographical subject, laying bare its effective splitting. Digital biography, on the other hand, confronts the subject with the flat and, to use Hegel's term, the unmoved simple of identity, unable to reach beyond itself and to self-dissipate. The identity of the subject, as constituted through the erasure of its own identity, is hence confronted with unerasable evidence, with an in itself of the permanent record of asubjective individuality stored in digital clouds, where, or rather nowhere, our unauthorized biographies dwell, and underneath which there dwells the tiny, fragile human body. The big other of biography is a complement of sorts of post-traumatic subjectivity as understood by Malabou. Is it coincidental that the concept of autistic subjectivity as alien to memory and remembrance should emerge at the precise time when unauthorized biographies are being tamed and regulated by the so-called right to be forgotten? The autistic post-traumatic subjectivity is radically foreign to the biography as such. The autistic subject is understood as the effect of an external trauma that remains uninterpretable and irreducible to personal history. As such, it presents the point of impossibility or the suspension of hermeneutics. But, and this will be the final point, the unauthorized biography as the product of digital domination presents the flip side of this impossibility. In it, the subject faces not a traumatic impossibility of hermeneutics, but rather its equally traumatic inescapability. And one last word on politics of digitization. Now, from a liberal perspective, the issues involved with digitization primarily have to do with privacy protection. However, in my mind, the main issues lie elsewhere. Many AI scholars have pointed out how the use of artificial intelligence is intended to root out the biases of human decision-making while entailing its own algorithmic biases. If Benjamin called for a politicization of art that counters the fascist aestheticization of politics, should we today opt for a politicization of digital systems countering the digitization of politics? Or are these systems already politicized in a very fundamental sense? I think so. Looking at the state's digitization of social protections, some have pointed out how these systems penalize the poor. Virginia Eubanks speaks of the creation of a digital poorhouse, for instance. It is clear to me that algorithmic biases perpetuate, if not create, class divisions. And we could use a provisional concept and say that digitization is inherently classified, reproducing and further accentuating class differences. So I want to conclude with an open question. I actually have no choice but to do that. So how do we get out of this? Or in Benjamin's terms, how do we bring about collective laughter in the so-called LOL world? Thanks for listening, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Simon. It was very insightful, opening so much and so many important questions, perspectives. So I'm sure we still have about 10 minutes for
Is it okay if I sit?
Of course, yeah. Just any questions?
Thanks, Simon, for that sharing that wonderful text with us. My question is, can't Adorno and Benjamin both be right about laughter, right? In other words, can there be different kinds of laughter or different functions of laughter, right? And if so, how do we tell the difference? Because I think what's fascinating about your comparison of the two is they disagree so fundamentally about the same examples, right? So if there can be differences, then how do we tell if both of them disagreed about two examples? So that's one thing. I hope that one's not too kind of easy. The second is to ask about if you think there's been a shift of the role of laughter in contemporary politics, and here I'm thinking about Trump, and in particular about how well the other night we were laughing at Trump, and I laugh. But kind of like the guy in the film, I'm uncomfortable in my laughter every time I'm laughing about Trump, right? And I think it's because Trump is a kind of tragicomic figure on the one hand, and then he's also, somehow I think laughter is essential to his power as well, right? In a sense, his speeches at political rallies are like stand-up comedy in a certain way. Yeah, so curious to hear your thoughts about the role of laughter in relation to contemporary political figures like Trump. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. I have very short replies to these two questions. Now, I hope that it was clear from the text that I do think that Adorno and Benjamin are right. But in a sense, I think the wrong thing to do would be to then, start distinguishing between different forms of laughter, to take a kind of an Aristotelian route of, devising all these different categories of laughter. And I think that I've also, at least that was my intention, to show that the crux of the matter in both cases is exactly the same, and that these two are flip sides of the same problem. But I nonetheless think that, you put it well, and this is really the most I'm going to talk about Trump is going to be saying this. I think that what Benjamin, grabs a hold of and is lost on Adorno is precisely this discomfort in laughter. So this dimension. In the Adornian theory of laughter, there is a kind of a presupposition that there's a blindness inherent to it. So there's a kind of a happy consciousness that is unaware of its own social conditioning. So his criticism stems from that. But Benjamin quite clearly hints at a discomfort, a kind of a discontent that is inherent to laughter. And I think the wider point would be that this point of inherent discomfort, even violence, is what makes laughter a potentially politically relevant activity, something to hold on to. So, but like I said, I hope this answers. I could go on, but I'd probably say more of the same. So I'll shut up.
No, I'm lacking the microphone, but yeah. Sorry, we have one microphone. Yeah, thank you. It's here. You're right.
Okay, thank you, Simon. This was great. I think I have sort of a localized question and a more general one. So the localized just stems from my own interest with this film, but maybe let me situate it within sort of the Benjamin discussion, right? Because for those who haven't watched the film, this is a movie about a filmmaker, right, who he does comedies, and then he decides to make a serious movie about the serious problem of poverty, gets in all kinds of trouble, and in the end decides not to make the movie. And then the Coen brothers make that movie. That's the movie Oh Brother, Where Art
Why do
Thou?
you assume that I saw the whole film?
No. But it's just to set up.
Does it ruin my point?
I don't know. I don't aspire to that. So it's in an obvious way a kind of a movie not only about movies, but specifically about comedies and about the ability of comedy to touch upon something serious like poverty, specifically, right? And this is of course the connection with Benjamin, who, as I understand him, thinks that cinema is precisely a kind of medium that can deal with experience once it was impoverished, right? That's sort of the idea. And I swear to God I had a question there. So, okay, so I mean, so the first naive question, when you sort of do the comparison to our contemporary situation, is just this basic fact of cinema being a collective, you know, present activity. This is, I mean, very naive, but clearly an important part of what's presented in the movie, somehow. Certainly relates, I think, to your themes about somehow barbarism surviving civilization, some kind of collectivity, right, that arises from this dire situation. Yeah, and then I guess my sort of more, I don't know if it's a critical remark, but maybe I didn't really understand you. I just don't think that you can say in any seriousness that the algorithms tell stories about us. I mean, that's just not, there is no real sense in which anybody is telling a story about you. I mean, your preferences are divided by algorithms to sell you other things, but there is no sense, and this, I mean, really, again, in a kind of naive, but nonetheless, I think, significant way, nobody keeps a file on you. Nobody cares about you. It's quite important. There's an automatic procedure which sees what you're doing in order to sell you other things. It's almost as if the internet would maybe want you to think that there's somehow stories are being told about you, but I think it's completely not the case. And okay, I'll stop here because I'm rambling. I need more time.
We have about 5 minutes and 4 more questions. So
Okay, Yuval, very quickly, when it comes to algorithmic storytelling, my point was precisely that it's not a coherent story. Like, that's what actually links it to the way Benjamin understands the story, precisely this fragmented structure that lets you slip in. But in case of digital systems, and I wouldn't be so sure that there is no one. I mean, in this sense, there is no one. But, you know, if you read a little bit on the subject of where digitization efforts of social services lead to, it's quite obvious that they are, in fact, enforcing a kind of a class struggle. You know, this is happening. There might not be a man pulling the strings, but there's certainly a system that is making use of these technologies to perpetuate its own inherent interest. So in this sense, I think you're wrong. And then the second thing about cinema being well suited for this, and you know, as a Benjamin scholar, I'm basically faking talking about Benjamin right now, compared to you, who spent, you know, years working through this complex theory. But one thing about cinema is not the cinematic, merely the cinematic experience of collectivity. It wouldn't have been possible as an art form if it weren't collective. It wasn't pay off. Making movies would never pay off. So it's already, so there are good economic reasons for its mass existence. But I do agree that Benjamin saw in cinema a kind of a tool, or a kind of an artistic tool that is able to capture the disappearing experience, or kind of entities on the verge of being, like kind of entities that only appear as they're drifting away. So I would definitely agree with that. But was there a critical point to this first part of the question? Okay.
Okay, I think you two should go coffee.
Been doing it.
And I'll join you. But we have 4 questions and 3 minutes, so please, short questions
So the
and
thing,
short answers.
Yeah, on the question of the choice between Benjamin and Adorno in relation to Thales, I mean, the definition of tragedy or the performance of tragedy always involves a physical aspect and performance of a character falling, whether in death by murder or in a physical comedy by stumbling over something and everyone laughs at it, a la Steve Martin, right? Or Chevy Chase hitting his head into a chandelier. And this brings up the idea, what Hegel says deep into the aesthetics, where comedy, that tragedy is the basis of and departure for comedy itself, and enables us to think about the symmetries and parallelisms between these two genres, and that it's impossible to sort of distinguish. Why I say this is because also Hegel, when he talks about laughter in the philosophy of mind, he's interested in the kind of indistinction between laughter and tears. You know, again, tears being the kind of cathartic, tragic response, and laughter being the comedic response. And then finally, we have, just to make things more confusing or conflated, I can't remember if you cited this in Apologies, but it goes to Benjamin's Arcades, where he talks about laughter as shattered articulation, which sounds very much like an Adornian thing to say about the inability to communicate and et cetera, et cetera. Shattered articulation is laughter. And he says that in the context of a reading of Baudelaire about the damned as people who are fatally cursed with an eternal grin, and that laughter is satanic. So I'm just giving these instances of where it's just impossible to distinguish between the two. At the moment, the question between the two arises early in Hegel and probably in somewhere deep in the emergence of Greek tragedy and satire, according to that story. Okay, thanks.
I think this wasn't a question, but I do appreciate the comment. And I think you're completely right. I mean, you're more of a Hegel scholar than I am, but I merely took, let's say, the dialectical structure. But I think what you were saying actually are examples of this, precisely examples of this. Maybe regarding Thales and so on, I skipped the section on Foucault, because it's highly interesting how everyone knows that he begins The Order of Things, so the 1966 book, with Borges and the laughter that shattered all, you know. But it also ends with philosophical laughter, explicitly with philosophical laughter. So there is a tradition that is let's say, anti-Adornian in the history of philosophy concerning laughter, and a prominent one too.
So thank you for the great talk. First is a comment and second is a brief question. So I think in poetics of comedy, trauma and resistance would be really flip sides. You could have both, right? And they are related to each other, but that was only the comment. So the question, I don't know if you intended to bridge laughter to the concept of master, but if so, would you go so far to say that master could have a traumatic foundation in the sense of that pure subject of death drive? Because that would shed another light on the concept, which I think is quite authoritarian. So that would, for me, be a new perspective on the concept of master.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. So the
question is, you've been talking about laughter, right? Laughing.
Sure.
Yes. So we are talking about masters. And it could be that you can just build bridges between the two topics, right? So if so, what would be if the master laughed, right? And would that be then that we could think of the master as an entity with a traumatic foundation?
Okay.
And then it would be not so authoritarian, and then I would have hope, and the evening would be saved.
Well, I think the obvious, and I hope I understood you right, because of course the kind of the connection between laughter and you know, domination was the kind of the thread that I was following throughout the paper. But if you ask what would be like a master that would laugh, so if Benjamin associates it with a kind of a collective doing away of you know, the strains of of domination, a laughing master would quite simply be a revolutionary. So this same collective force is a form of mastery. I didn't, and I apologize for that, quite understand the authoritarian part, but that might be, you know, my own conditioning.
Okay. There was. Sorry, Arthur. Sorry. Please.
Oh, okay.
But please be sure. Yeah, because we're.
Hey, thank you very much for the amazing talk. I wanted to go to the last part, which I think is very interesting with regard to contemporary times and technologies of humor, in a sense. There's lack of mentioning about memes, which is a very distinct experience in the cinema, where the question of the collective as something which is shared between everyone and anyone, and at the same time something which is experienced usually kind of personally, but at the same time in a space which is collective, kind of eschews a lot of how one conceptualized the collective experience of cinema that was shown. And if you want, I think, to try to think about laughter and how do we laugh in a digital age, we need to encounter this new form of laugh making. And question is, how can you view it dialectically? Can you dialectalize memeing? I think that's one of the points which is important because it is a distinct experience.
I just decided if it's okay for you that we collect it.
So I wanted to say something a bit long to justify why the question is so short. But the question is just, what would you say about the relationship between laughter and maybe the joke or the comic object which would induce this laughter? And I have more to say about this, but because it's...
Okay, can you just pass it to
Thank you. Very quickly, why no Bataille in this discussion? You know, for Bataille, dialectics can't laugh, which makes the dialectic itself laughable, and in particular, it makes the master-slave dialectic laughable. And you know, if I wanted a figure for, you know, Bataille's reading of the master-slave and the master in particular, I might nominate Pluto the dog, because you know, Pluto is someone who constantly risks his life, but yet never dies. Is this, you know, incredible, indestructible cartoon? So.
Thank you.
Just, I'll start at the end. I mean, thank you so much for the comment. I mean, it's a wonderful one. I don't know if it actually demands a response, except in why did I not include Bataille? I think in a sense, I mean, it would have been a productive reference, but I've already cut like 3 or 4 that are along the same lines. So that's the sole reason for it. Now, laughter and jokes, that's a slightly longer story, one that was addressed by Alenka in her comedy book. So I think, well, a couple of things. I mean, jokes have a kind of a dramatic form. So there's a reliance on language that is kind of subtracted when it comes to seeing a Disney film, an animated Disney film. So it immediately entails a kind of a more complicated relationship with language that is the precondition of the existence of jokes. So if anything happens, joke-wise, if laughter occurs, it is kind of it is rehearsed. It has a linguistic backbone that is structured in very precise terms. So you can only retell a joke, you know, by retelling it verbatim. You can't really do it your own way. You can't have your own special take on a joke. So this is one thing. And another thing, perhaps, where I ended, there was another section of this text that actually dealt with the thesis that the dead and buried storytelling actually continued its existence, its afterlife, precisely in the form of jokes. jokes retained this essence of storytelling. And for the last question, I don't really know what to say. I don't use memes. I think I should look into it better, kind of immerse myself in internet culture more than I do. But yeah, not really sure. It's a totally open question for me. What to think, what to make of memes. But I have paused a little bit while thinking about this topic with the LOL. There was an occasion, it seems that a large percentage of people don't actually know what LOL is, but they use it constantly. So it's a curious thing. So somebody got an email, a message from their mother, and the message says, our dog just died, LOL. She was convinced that meant lots of love. And it's kind of a placeholder for something, but it's not entirely clear what the place is that it's holding. So.
Thank you so much, Simon, again. So I think we can applaud you again.